1922 is the year in which, in the beginning, Ratti becomes Pope Pius XI. Later that year, the March on Rome of the fascists takes place, and Benito Mussolini becomes the head of government, soon to become the dictator of Italy, and will rule for 2 decades.
Hello, I'm Alfred Uhry. Clearly, I'm not an Italian scholar, but I am honored and delighted to be here with my friend David Kertzer. This is a very exciting book, and I can't wait myself to hear more about it. So why don't you start off, David? That'll be great.
Okay. Well, yeah, we thought it might make sense, since the book just came out today, if I spent the first just 3 or 4 or 5 minutes giving a little sketch of what the book tries to do, and then we'll see what kinds of questions Alfred has. The book begins with a particular kind of coincidence, namely in 1922, shortly after the end of the First World War, 2 men come to power in their own way in the same city, in Rome, in Italy. 1922 is the year in which, in the beginning, Ratti becomes Pope Pius XI. Later that year, the March on Rome of the fascists takes place, and Benito Mussolini becomes the head of government, soon to become the dictator of Italy, and will rule for 2 decades. The story of their relationship has been a highly contentious one. The history has been a contentious one. They're very different versions of what actually happened. And the recent openings of the archives for this period in the Vatican allow us, for the first time really, to, I think, get it to the bottom of the story, and that's what I try to do in the book. Very briefly, you see here pictured the 2 protagonists of the book, along with the cover of the book. They're very different kinds of personalities, as you can imagine, although one of the peculiar things I found is they strangely had some commonalities, despite their obvious differences. Benito Mussolini, we'll have a picture of him here when he is still a young man. He's only 39 years old when he becomes Prime Minister of Italy in 1922. He comes from a strong anti-clerical background. He had previously been a major socialist, one of the leaders of the radical wing of the Socialist Party in Italy before founding the fascist movement, basically during World War I. And along with this kind of anti-clerical bully who's come to power through violence, we have Ratti, who had spent most of his life as a Vatican librarian, and had rather suddenly become the Archbishop of Milan and a cardinal just a year before the Pope Benedict XV died in early 1922. There was a struggle between 2 different factions, and they ended up with a compromise candidate, namely Ratti, who becomes Pope Pius XI. Now, why would Mussolini and the Pope make a deal? The Pope had no illusions about Mussolini. He was a well-known anti-cleric. Mussolini had referred to priests as black microbes and parasites and so forth. But they each had something to gain, and that's the story that the book tells. I won't go into detail now, but the book traces why, from early on, the Pope makes this decision to make a kind of alliance, an agreement, with the soon-to-be dictator, how the Pope saves Mussolini when it looks like in 1924 his regime would fall, and then goes through how the Pope used his secret emissary, a Jesuit, a rather shadowy figure that very little had been written about, to go and visit with him one-on-one monthly to bring various demands that we can talk about, that basically he wanted to be able to use the fascist regime for certain purposes to benefit the church. But there's another part of the book, and that is the part of the disillusionment of the Pope with Mussolini, and especially as Mussolini grows ever closer to Hitler in the 1930s. The Pope, Pius XI, hated Hitler, was distraught when Mussolini gets closer and closer to him. And the last third or so of my book, I guess, focuses on the dramatic years leading up to the World War, and a major player in these years is the number 2 in the Vatican at the time, Eugenio Pacelli, who as Secretary of State becomes very influential in brokering the relationship between the fascist regime and the Pope. Eugenio Pacelli, of course, is best known as the successor of Pius XI when he becomes Pope Pius XII, the wartime controversial Pope Pius XII. So I think, let me just show, I was going to show just some quick images here of some of the personages in the book, and then we can start our conversation. I mentioned this emissary, the private emissary that the Pope had to Mussolini, who met with him, I discovered, over 100 times one-on-one in these years, in the 20s and 30s, carrying the messages of the Pope. This is Eugenio Pacelli, the Secretary of State, beginning in 1930 and through the last decade of Pius XI's reign, and then succeeds him. The alliance that Mussolini makes with Hitler, who initially idolized Mussolini and modeled himself after Mussolini, is shown here with the King of Italy, another figure in the book, Victor Emmanuel III. Vladimir Ledachowski is the world head of the Jesuit order, another figure in my book, not very well known. There are no good studies really of him, yet he was the worldwide head of the Jesuit order for many decades. He plays a key role in preventing the Pope from turning against fascism. Here you just see some examples when we talk about the racial laws. Certainly one of the dramas in the book is the dramatic imposition of the racial laws, the anti-Semitic racial laws in the fall of 1938, when all Jewish children were thrown out of the public schools, Jewish teachers and professors were all fired, Jewish professionals lost their jobs, and so on. And to get to the true story of what was the Vatican's role in all of this, what was the Vatican's reaction, this too is part of what the book examines. Here you see some of these main players around the Pope, who I discovered play a role in preventing a break with the fascist regime, the alliance that the Vatican had formed with the fascist regime. In his last days, the Pope would die in February 1939. The Pope made various efforts to denounce, or at least potentially denounce, Mussolini and fascism, but he was weakened, as popes can be in their last years, and this made the work of the people around him easier. And then the Eugenio Pacelli, Pope Pius XI, Secretary of State, succeeds him as Pope Pius XII. Cardinal Caccia da Mignone is another figure in the book perhaps we'll get to, but we'll leave him off for the moment. And at the end of the story, Pius XII becomes the Pope, and of course the war begins. That's a very quick capsule of the book.
That's a race through the book, but I was interested to learn not that long ago that Italy had only been Italy when these two men came into power for 50 years. There was no formal Italy before that. And I think it's interesting, the relationship of Italy itself to the Vatican and why the Vatican disliked Italy as Italy.
Yeah, people think of Italy as this ancient state, but it was only founded in 1861, and it was only founded by a war with the Papal States. The Italian peninsula was divided into various units. One of the major ones was under the power of the Pope, had been for 1,000 years, stretched from Rome up through Ferrara and Bologna. So to unify Italy, the whole unification movement, the so-called Risorgimento, was a movement against the power, the political power of the papacy. So when Rome then was taken and made the capital, 1870, 1871, Italy is finally created in its modern form. The Pope at the time, Pius IX, who's a pope you're familiar with, pronounces himself a prisoner of the Vatican and excommunicates the king, excommunicates the prime minister, says no good Catholic should participate in the Italian state in any way. So this situation lasts formally until the period that Mussolini comes to power. So this is the background of the Vatican rejecting the legitimacy of the Italian state.
So the Vatican did not recognize the state of Italy.
That's right.
They did not recognize the government.
Did not formally recognize the government. Now, they had one thing, however, that did happen by the early 20th century. First of all, it became clear to almost everybody that they were not going to regain the papal states,
Right.
which had been their ambition in the late 19th century. But the other worry that the Vatican now had was the rising socialist movement. And so many in the Vatican began to see the folly of continuing to reject the government, and calling, for example, the idea that Catholics shouldn't vote. They wanted Catholics to vote against the socialists. So there began a period in the around from before the First World War where there were many in the Vatican who realized it would be better to try to make some kind of deal with the establishment parties in the Italian government.
So the position of that king, who himself is fascinating, he was tiny, right? He was like 5 feet tall.
Right.
And that picture you just showed of Mussolini and Hitler going like that, and that little tiny man going like that, is. But so was he a figurehead king, sort of like, was it like England? I mean, he had nothing to do with the law.
Well, he actually would lose power under Mussolini. He technically, well, he had the power to appoint government. So he did, for example, in 1924, there's this rather dramatic case where the head of the Reform Socialists, opposition to Mussolini in Parliament, there were still other parties in Parliament at the time, was murdered in the middle of Rome by fascist thugs, basically on Mussolini's orders. And although Mussolini would deny it, and it looked like Mussolini was going to fall, but the Pope comes to his rescue, and because they're afraid that the only way to bring down Mussolini was to have a coalition which would involve the Catholics with the socialists, and the Pope was opposed to that. So another element of this is a so-called popular party. The Italian Popular Party was created in 1919 by a priest as the Catholic party. So there was, at the time Mussolini comes to power, a Catholic party in Italy that was anti-fascist. So what Mussolini really needed was for the Pope to delegitimize the Catholic party, and this is what happens.
Why was, at the outset here, why did the Pope want to gain, what was in it for the Pope to gain Mussolini as an ally?
Well, the church at that time, you have to realize this is the pre-Second Vatican Council. With the Second Vatican Council, Pope John XXIII, everything changes in the church. But back then, the church did not recognize the value of separation of church and state. They rejected the notion of freedom of religion, freedom of conscience, and so on. And therefore, they thought they could make a deal where Mussolini, for his own ends, would be willing to bring back a lot of those aspects, end the separation of church and state, give financial and other benefits to the church, place the clergy in a position of honor that they had lost with the fall of the papal states. So this was the nature of the deal that was made.
And on Mussolini's side, it wasn't just popular. Why did he need the Pope so much? I mean, it's a little easier to understand, but...
Well, yeah, I think for him there are two things. First of all, in order to come to power, and especially to establish his dictatorship, he needed to end the Popular Party, which was a very large mass party in Italy, and it was the Catholic Party, headed by the priest. The other thing is he needed international legitimacy. I mean, he came to power through this march of his kind of masses of ragtag army threatening to take over the capital in a kind of a putsch or a coup. And who better than the Pope to give that legitimacy? And in fact, that is how it worked.
You mean if he had the sanction of the church, he would look better to the world?
That's right. And this would culminate in 1929 with a formal agreement between the Italian state, between Mussolini and the Vatican and the Pope, which is what established Vatican City. The Vatican City that we now know as a sovereign state only existed thanks to that agreement with Mussolini in 1929.
So it behooved both parties to have that agreement. What's it called? I've forgotten.
The Lateran Accords.
Right. But that behooved both parties to have that agreement.
Well, there's something even more than that, because there was another advantage to the dictatorship from the Pope's point of view, because he could call this figure I mentioned, the shadowy Jesuit figure here, Father Taccaventuri. What kinds of requests was he bringing every month to the Pope? He was asking that books be censored that the church objected to, that women not be allowed to wear immodest dress, for example. And among the things the Pope was most concerned about, he was worried about the spread of Protestant proselytizing in Italy. In the past, under the liberal governments, the Pope could not ask for any intervention by the state or the police. Now, the Pope could and did regularly ask Mussolini to send the police to stop the Protestants from organizing and, for example, the YMCA from trying to spread into Italy.
I mean, I think you've already said that, but where Mussolini came from not caring, he was a socialist. So he didn't care at all about the women covering themselves properly or, I mean, he liked them uncovered.
Right, in fact, and well, yes, Mussolini, one of the things, sometimes I wondered how Mussolini got anything done. He had so many mistresses, so many children by so many women, but, and there'd be months where he'd go with his mistress to the beach at Ostia every day, and he'd be gone from the office for several hours. So, how you put that together with the micromanager who wanted to know every single detail?
I mean, personality-wise, he would strut around bare-chested, and the Pope was a very sort of scholarly man. I mean, it couldn't have been different types.
Right, it couldn't. So Mussolini, of course, he created this cult of the Duce, which is something, by the way, the Pope also wasn't that happy about, and he tried to send him advice to tone it down, but of course, Mussolini, he didn't pay any attention. So there are these two personalities that are very, very different. They're both authoritarian in their own way. The people around them kind of quaked in their boots when they went to meet with them. But other than that, they were very, very different kinds of personalities, very, very different values. Yet they saw in each other and the Pope talked about the fact that God sometimes chose strange instruments for working his way. And Mussolini was a very strange instrument, yes.
Well, how does Hitler fit into all this stuff?
So Hitler models himself on Mussolini. He has a big bust of Mussolini in his office in Munich.
By 1922, Hitler was still small.
Right, it's kind of small potatoes when Mussolini comes to power. So Hitler comes to power as Chancellor of Germany in January 1933. Mussolini had already been in power for over a decade. And Mussolini initially sees Hitler as a slightly deranged acolyte of his, and he makes various jokes about him. But of course, things change for a variety of reasons, and they decide to make a pact eventually by the mid-30s. The Pope hates Hitler, this Pope Pius XI. For a variety of reasons. One, of course, he has no sympathy for racial ideology. Aryan supremacy makes no sense to the Pope. But also, the influence of the Catholic Church in in Germany is suffering. For example, at the time Hitler came to power in Bavaria, the largest Catholic region in Germany, 2/3 of all the school children went to Catholic parochial schools. By the late 30s, this would be down to 2%. So the Pope was very concerned about the loss of church influence, concerned about Nazi ideology. But curiously, although on the one hand, this would eventually turn him or potentially turn him against Mussolini, for many years in the 30s, it had, in a way, the opposite effect. Because the Pope was concerned about what was happening to the church in Germany under Nazism. Who was going to help him? Who might have influence with Hitler? Well, he only knew one person, really, and that was Mussolini. So one of the things I discovered in the archives was constant attempts and requests by the Pope to get Mussolini to intercede on the Pope's behalf with Hitler.
There was not really a Jewish problem in Italy because there weren't very many Jews. The percentage of Jews in Italy was small, wasn't it?
It was 1/10 of 1%. There were about 35,000.
As opposed to somewhere like Poland, it was 1 in 10 or something.
Right. So much, much different.
So there was there was always anti-Semitism somewhere, but it was not a problem in Italy in 1920, in the 20s.
Right. So this was a big difference, of course, between Hitler, sometimes people talk about fascism and Nazism and think of them in the same way. And of course, there are some similarities. But Italian fascism and Mussolini did not begin as an anti-Semitic movement. There were Jews involved in the fascist movement. There were fascist Jewish mayors and members of government and so forth. So it would become as a surprise to the Jewish community in the 30s, later 30s, when Mussolini turns against the Jews. So that being a Jewish fascist was not a problem. Being a Jewish Nazi, of course, made absolutely no sense. It was impossible.
So is Nazism an offshoot of fascism, or a particular kind of fascism?
I think it can be seen that way. As I mentioned, Hitler modeled himself on Mussolini. It was a movement. It was, of course, an anti-socialist, anti-communist movement, a movement that rejected multi-party democracy and parliament. They were nationalist movements. But what certainly the biggest difference was Nazism had at its very core a racial ideology of racial supremacy and anti-Semitism, and initially Italian fascism did not.
Well, it's interesting. I think I read it in your book that in this country, people didn't equate Mussolini with Hitler until right up to 1940, did they? I mean, Hitler was, nobody liked Hitler and everybody was anti, but Mussolini, like Fiorello LaGuardia didn't want to come out against Mussolini, right?
Yeah, I mean, this is kind of amazing. So Mussolini had a positive reputation. I mean, they were always anti-fascist, of course, and the left was anti-fascist in the US, but in the general population, for example, both Republican and Democratic presidents, 20s and into the 30s, were not averse to Mussolini. I mean, they were a little bit patronizing. They took the idea, oh, those Italians, it's not like Americans. They need a strong man, someone to, ride herd over them. They're too disorderly and so forth. But it was only with the invasion of Ethiopia by Mussolini in 1935 and his increasing embrace of Hitler that the American public and American political leaders began to turn, including FDR, began to turn against Mussolini. The LaGuardia example is interesting because LaGuardia's mother was from an Italian-Jewish family. In 1938, the anti-Semitic laws are proclaimed in Italy. The Italian-Jewish community is devastated, but LaGuardia still will not criticize Mussolini. Why? Because the Italian-American community was so important to him politically, and the Italian-American community was still overwhelmingly pro-Mussolini at that time.
It's interesting because now we equate Mussolini and Hitler as the arch enemies of us and the Allies in World War II. But before World War II, as you say, there were different issues.
Right, and one of the things I discovered working in these archives is that, for example, FDR sends his ambassador to Italy to, well, first of all, tries to get him to get the Pope to prevent Mussolini from joining up with Hitler.
Right.
So there's that going on. He also has his ambassador meet secretly with the king to get the king to intercede to prevent Mussolini from going to war on Hitler's side. And that
well, could the king really have? Well, he was kind of a weak king, wasn't he?
He was very weak, and I tell this story in the book that the ambassador rushes to meet with him, having gotten these instructions. The American ambassador, having gotten the instructions from FDR, he finds him in his hunting, fishing little hut in the mountains outside of Turin, and he reads this letter from FDR basically begging him to intercede with Mussolini to prevent him from going to war on Hitler's side. And the king responds, I'm sorry, I'm just a constitutional monarch, I can't do a thing about it. And all he wanted to talk about was the fact that so far he'd caught 700 trout, and he never stopped till he caught 1,000 trout. That was the key.
I don't think one could make up as a writer that a weak king would be absolutely teeny tiny and wear great big hats, and it would be easy to know he wasn't there because he didn't even come up to people's shoulders.
Well, yeah, I mean, this is, unfortunately, it had an impact. So on the one hand, it seems very cruel to talk about this, and but it certainly had a psychological impact on him. Being so short and being the brunt of various jokes all the time and having to wear all this, fancy hats and so forth, he realized he looked ridiculous. An American reporter referred to him, he would only appear in Parliament when he absolutely had to, or in public when he absolutely had to. One of the times was each year opening of Parliament. And this American reporter, Ann McCormick, talked about seeing him sitting in his throne in his finery, but his feet didn't touch the ground. So this, I think, partially explains the kind of relationship he ended up with Mussolini and being pushed around the way he was.
So, Pius XI, the Pope that you write about, the people that were close to him, his posse, his guys that were his guys, led the papacy in a direction that maybe he didn't want to go. I mean, toward fascism, towards all that stuff. Not fascism so much, but towards Mussolini and towards singling out Jews and...
Yeah, I mean, I think there are two different periods here. At the very beginning, so Mussolini comes to power only months after the Pope has become Pope. And in fact, the church had been critical of the fascists before this. For one thing, they didn't trust Mussolini because of his socialist past, and because there were a lot of anti-clerics in the fascist movement. So that, for instance, the week in which the fascists come to power in 1922, the unofficial Jesuit publication of the Vatican, Civiltà Cattolica, Catholic Civilization, has a kind of anti-fascist editorial. The Pope immediately lets them know, as does the world head of the Jesuit order, that they have to change their tune, that now they need to take a much more tolerant attitude and eventually a uncritical attitude largely toward Mussolini. So early on, the Pope was certainly a man very much in charge. Partly this has to do with age. As he got older, begins to get more infirm, but also the ties tying the fascist regime to the Vatican become tighter and tighter. The benefits of the Vatican become greater and greater, so that by the time that the Pope becomes so dismayed about Mussolini embracing Hitler and then the pronouncement of the racial laws in 1938, the men around the Pope are fiercely protective of that relationship with Mussolini, with the fascist regime, and do what they need to prevent the Pope.
One of those being Taki the gentleman we showed earlier.
Right, so Taki Venturi plays, I think, and nothing good really has been, or much has been written about him before my book, amazingly to me. I mean, no one met 100 times privately, one-on-one with Mussolini, other than his inner circle. And here's a representative of the Pope meeting with him every month throughout these years. What is he doing? Well, one thing I discover is he's really, in a way, a kind of double agent. He's supposed to be the Pope's representative to Mussolini, but what I find is he is at least as much, certainly by the late 30s, Mussolini's man in the Vatican, and doing all he can to be sure the Pope doesn't lash out against fascism and lash out against Mussolini.
Do you think that was always his bid, or do you think he became more Mussolini's man as he went along?
Well, he was already, by 1928, I discovered signing his letters to Mussolini, "You're a loyal fascist," which as the rather unusual. I mean, not only is he a Jesuit priest, but he's the emissary of the Pope. So whether the Pope realized that, I don't know. They were roughly age mates. They did have quite a close relationship, that is the Pope and this Jesuit Taki Venturi.
I think it's interesting that the prevailing belief, until you wrote this book, was that the Pope and the Church valiantly fought against fascism and Mussolini all those years.
Yeah. Right, now here you need to distinguish, there certainly have been scholars who question that popular belief, but in Italy, certainly it's the overwhelming belief. It's also the more or less official position of the Church and has been. But it just is a myth. The myth is based on two contentions, that is, people who claim that there was this opposition. One is that the lay organization Catholic, it's called Catholic Action, is the organization of the laity at the local level under ecclesiastical control, that this was the only organization allowed to exist under fascism that was independent of fascism, and that it was in a constant struggle with the fascist regime. But what I discovered is that, in fact, Catholic Action came to rely heavily on fascist police powers. One of the things I discovered is that the Catholic Action local groups were given instructions. They had something called the Secretariat of Morality to go out and look for both the scantily clad women, but also publications that the church deemed heretical and so forth, and report them to the fascist police and get the fascist police to take action. So there was this really a kind of alliance, not that there weren't some tensions occasionally, but The national head of Catholic Action was someone who regarded himself as a loyal fascist, for example, and was regarded by the fascists as a loyal fascist.
So how long did it take after the fall of Mussolini and after all that, when Pius XII was still alive, because he was for a number of years, did they change the story right away after World War II?
Well, this is part of a larger story which doesn't just involve the church, so I think it's important to put this in a larger context. It's not just the church that came up with a new narrative for their history that purged the alliance with fascism. It was true very widely in Italy. Right after the war, what would emerge as the major party in Italy that would rule Italy into about 1990 is the Christian Democratic Party.
Right.
So, which was very closely linked with the Vatican and with the church, and parish priests would basically campaign for the Christian Democratic Party. They needed to represent themselves and represent the church as having always been anti-fascist after the total disaster that came of fascism with what happened in World War II and the horrible experience it was for Italy and Italians. But it wasn't just the church, it wasn't just the Christian Democratic Party, it's many in Italy. Everybody, it's a little like France and other examples, everybody was part of the resistance, nobody was a fascist.
Right.
So it has to be seen in that context.
Because it's just interesting the way that history changes. What's interesting to me is we're not just talking about the church, because the church is just like a paradigm for any other organization where things move the popular way. And I assume that it made political sense for Pius XI to move in Mussolini's direction. But what's so fascinating about the book that we haven't talked about is how things began to change, and how Pius XI began to dislike what he had done.
All right, so Pius XI, he's getting to be, he's in his 80s, he's had a variety of health problems by the late 1930s. And as I mentioned, he has this loathing for Hitler and does not like what he sees Mussolini becoming closer and closer to Hitler. And I think begins to realize that he has made a kind of pact with the devil and begins to lash out. But it even began with the Ethiopian War, the same thing that turned the American public and American politicians against Mussolini.
Which was what, 35?
30 begins in October 35. The Pope is going to, seems to be about to criticize the launch of the war. Mussolini has made known that he's planning to create his own empire for Italy and that the first step would be taking over Ethiopia. So the Pope, speaking off the cuff to just an audience that he happened to be speaking to, adds at the end of it, after his blessing, that warning Mussolini entering into war would be a terrible tragedy and could not be justified. It would be an unjust war. This is now in August of 1935, just as Mussolini's planning the invasion. The men around the Pope and his Secretary of State office are alarmed by this. And one of the things you now find, it's kind of incredible in the archives that have recently been available, is exactly how they worked to undermine the Pope. Yeah. So one of the major figures under Pacelli, his kind of one of his number 2 men, kept a diary, and he tells us what he did after meeting with his colleagues. After the speech, they were so horrified because the Pope's remarks were supposed to be published the next day in the Vatican daily newspaper, the Osservatore Romano. And they're deathly afraid of, if this word gets out, what Mussolini's reaction will be. And so in the diary that this Monsignor keeps in the Secretary of State office, he literally says, we performed a, quote, surgical operation. We cut out a sentence here, changed a sentence there. And then he tells the next morning, because he'd have to get approval of the new text from the Pope, of the experience of taking the typescript to the Pope asking for his approval. And he was hoping the Pope would just sign off on it, but the Pope, of course, knew what was up and goes immediately to the section of his speech where he addressed these issues, the war, and he mutters to himself and out loud and says, but this is not what I said. But by putting constant pressure on him and warning him that no one thinks this is a good idea, and given that he was already beginning to be more infirm, they could wear him down. And so the text that was published in the Vatican newspaper contained no criticism of the war.
And as the years then went by and he became more and more infirm, and I think the book, according to your book, more and more horrified by, I don't know if horrified would be the word you would use, by the pact he had made with Mussolini, and he wanted to do something about it.
Right, so one of the things that we did know from some recent very good work, well, it's now maybe over 10 years old, there had been a so-called secret encyclical that the Pope had commissioned. So right around the time of Hitler visits, you saw that picture of Hitler visiting Rome in the spring of 1938, the Pope, who's at his summer residence, I think it's June perhaps, June of 1938, just the month after Hitler was there, he calls in a Jesuit, an American Jesuit, who was known for a book he had written against racism in the United States.
Lafarge was it?
Yeah, John Lafarge is his name. He's a prominent American Jesuit who was very concerned about racial discrimination in the United States. And the Pope was familiar with this book, knew he was there, and without telling Eugenio Pacelli, his Secretary of State, without telling the other people around him, he summoned this man and gave him a secret mission. The mission was draft for me an encyclical denouncing racism and anti-Semitism.
And before that, had the racial purity thing come out from Mussolini?
This was right before it. So it was the month before. It would be in July that Mussolini would proclaim the new racial doctrine, and then by the end of the summer, beginning of September, the anti-Jewish laws would begin to be trotted out. The problem is that because he was a Jesuit, he needed to get the permission of the head of the Jesuit order, this fellow, if I can go back, see his picture, Vladimir Ledachowski. Now, Ledachowski was, I know I've seen his correspondence both in Jesuit archives and in Vatican archives. And not just that, do you see the anti-Semitism, which had been there for a long time, but when the racial laws are proclaimed and they're worried, when the new racial policy is proclaimed in July 38, Mussolini's worried that the Pope may speak out against it. He sends his ambassador to find the one person he thinks could most help him prevent the Pope from trying to defend the Jews. And his ambassador to the Holy See goes to see this man, Ledachowski, and in reporting back to Mussolini why he chose to see him, he said, I decided he would be our best bet because I knew of his, quote, implacable loathing for the Jews. And in fact, in his conversation, which we know from the Italian ambassador's account of this, his written account, Ledachowski basically blamed the Jews for all that was wrong in Europe, basically endorsed the idea that there should be anti-Semitic laws, and said that the Pope had gotten totally out of control, that Pacelli could not control him, and that all the people around the Pope, Pacelli, Ledachowski, Taki Venturi, and so on, were at wit's end, and something had to be done to stop the Pope from destroying the relationship between the Vatican and the fascist state.
So meantime, the Pope has gotten that American Jesuit to work on this.
Right, so now's the problem, that in order for him to work on this, he has to get Ledachowski's permission because of the discipline of the Jesuit order. So this is the last person, really, the Pope would want to have involved in this, but Ledachowski says that what does Father Lafarge, this American father who's never had any experience with writing encyclicals, know about writing encyclicals? So he places two other Jesuits, including a German Jesuit, who was kind of the German Jesuit expert on the Jews, to work with him in Paris on this. It's curious that this other Jesuit basically believed there was a good anti-Semitism and a bad anti-Semitism, and the bad anti-Semitism was racially based. The good was based on not just religious ideas, but the pernicious economic, social, and moral influence of Jews.
But the Pope went ahead with a speech, didn't he? He wrote a speech.
Well, so a couple things happened. So now you have sort of two different tracks. In Paris, this group of Jesuits with the American Father Lafarge had their marching orders to write an encyclical denouncing anti-Semitism and racism. And the FAR certainly, I think, wants to do this, and they do come up with a draft. They send it in, but they have to send it in first to Ledahowski, to this Jesuit general, thinking he's going to immediately give it to the Pope. He doesn't. He holds on to it. He won't give it to the Pope. He says it's totally unacceptable. He can't show it to the Pope. Meanwhile, the Pope, what's going on in Italy, the racial laws are pronounced. And the Pope is, in fact, hurt by all this, does not believe in racial supremacy, goes against his idea of Catholic doctrine, the universality of the Catholic faith. And he begins lashing out in addresses. For example, in one of his audiences, he says, I can't understand why the Italian leader sees the need to go and imitate the Germans. And if there's one thing Mussolini hated, it was being thought to be the fawn, imitator of Hitler.
Well, even if he had these people around him, nobody muzzled him. Nobody told him. You couldn't stop him from saying what he said.
And this is what, in reading the Vatican archives now, this is exactly what the papers are filled of the people around him, lamenting the fact. And when they meet with the Italian, Mussolini's emissaries who come and complain, they say, we wish we could stop them, but what can we do? They're not part of any notes he has in advance. He just is off the cuff. We do what we can after he says these things.
So he's getting older and sicker as he goes, right?
He is. He's getting quite frail. And then the end will come in a very dramatic fashion. Don't want to give away the whole book, but there is this conspiracy theory that he was in fact murdered by Mussolini, which I actually think is not accurate, but the dramatic timing of his death.
As a player, I don't want to give away that what went on. You're going to read the book to know it all. But I don't think anybody could make it up. It's amazingly. It's got terrific irony, what happened, and the fact that his successor was Pacelli, who was perfectly in sync with Mussolini, and helped round up Jews and do all of that stuff.
Well, I wouldn't go so far. Pacelli did not help round up Jews. I mean, I think one thing that is important to note, that even the where you had anti-Semitism in the church, it never took the form of Jews should be exterminated. So
well, he didn't stop it, did he?
Well, this is a huge controversy about the so-called silence of Pope Pius XII, which has led to very almost violent kind of quarrels and denunciations. The fact of the matter is that throughout the war, so in February of 1939, just before the war breaks out, my Pope, Pius XI, dies. In March, his number two man, Eugenio Pacelli, as Secretary of State, is elected Pope and takes the name of Pius XII. What would happen when the Jews began to be rounded up? So it was in 1943, Mussolini, there's a coup. The Allies have landed in Sicily in July 1943. Mussolini is overthrown in Rome. But the Nazis then Hitler sends down the German troops throughout Italy, and they take over Rome, take over all of central and northern Italy. Now the Vatican is surrounded by German troops, and one of their highest priorities, of course, is rounding up the Jews to send them to Auschwitz to their death. In October of 1943, the Nazis try to round up all the Jews of Rome. They round up a little over 1,000. They are put in a pen, men, women, little babies, right literally in the shadow of the Vatican. And the Pope is concerned, and he has his number two man meet with his Secretary of State, meet with the Nazi ambassador, the German ambassador to Italy, to lament this fact and call on them to free the Jews. And he says, do you really want this? The German ambassador says, do you really want me to tell Hitler that you are unhappy and want him to change? And his Secretary of State, the Cardinal, says, well, I'll leave it to your judgment. So the fact is that the Pope saw himself as in a position to moderate the dispute or mediate the dispute between the sides in the war. And he always took the position that, till virtually the very end, that he should not speak out directly against Hitler or what Hitler was doing, because that would be taking sides.
One thing before we go to these questions, which are a lot, I think everybody would be interested in how you came to write this. I know that when was the material on Pius XI released that you could read it?
2006.
So how did you know? You must have felt something in the air. How did you know that this, you didn't know all of this stuff until you did the research? I mean, because nobody knew, right?
Right, but there were various ways of knowing something. For one thing, the fascist archives were open. So, for instance, all these meetings between the meeting between Ledachowski, the Jesuit general, and the Italian ambassador, we had the Italian ambassador's accounts of those meetings. And similarly, other kinds of accounts of people who met with high Vatican officials, including the Italian ambassador's regular meetings with Pacelli, with the Secretary of State. So we knew quite a bit, and of course there were people who lived through that period, so we had various kinds of memoirs and so on that had been available. So the Vatican archives weren't available, but a variety of other things were. The other thing I knew was there was huge controversy over this period. So it was just such a dramatic, such a fateful period. It just seemed too attractive, a kind of intellectual or scholarly project or book project.
You didn't know you were going to strike this kind of gold, would you?
No, well, I'd worked in Vatican archives for many years on other projects, so I was familiar with them. I had some sense of what we would find there, but there were some documents I found that really bowled me over, and which I discuss in the book.
I'm going to ask you some of these questions. Okay. What was the most surprising thing you learned about either man? Something that challenged a preconception you had?
Give an example of Mussolini. In 1933, shortly after Hitler comes to power in Germany, he announces the first anti-Semitic measures. He's throwing out all the Jews from the civil service and so forth, and they're not able to practice professions, at least with Christians anymore, as doctors and lawyers and so on. Who is it who protests? Is it the Pope? No, the Pope doesn't protest. Mussolini. So I discovered that Mussolini, and curiously, these documents were in the Vatican archives, no one, I don't think, has found them in Mussolini's archives. Mussolini has his ambassador to Berlin meet with Hitler to tell him this is a very bad idea. You should not be acting against the Jews in Germany. I mean, I don't think this fact was ever known before. And there are a variety of reasons why he did this. At the same time, he didn't want to anger Hitler too much, so he said, I'm telling you this for your own good, that not only do I think it's bad policy, but it'll just get you internationally isolated, plus the Jews are pretty influential in a lot of countries, and it's not a good idea. Now, Mussolini would be the first person to do this. Is kind of incredible. Pope, the most dramatic document, which I think is still a little bit, is still shocking, is that I discovered that the Pope, before the racial laws went into effect, despite all his misgivings, used Tacchi Venturi to work out a deal with Mussolini, offering not to oppose the racial laws publicly if he took certain action in benefiting various Catholic organizations. And having that document in your hand is just kind of breathtaking.
I imagine. Now, here's one that's going to interest me. Can you talk about the current new Pope and what changes we might expect during his tenure? I don't know if that's your field, but that's a question.
There's a lot of course, enthusiasm in many quarters. The new Pope, although if you go on Catholic conservative websites, there's also a lot of concern about the new Pope. I think the new Pope is certainly a breath of fresh air for many people who were concerned about the very conservative turn under a couple of most recent popes. And in Italy and elsewhere, it's produced a lot of enthusiasm, more people attending Mass and so forth. There are clearly many power centers in the Vatican that are quite concerned about his idea of cleaning house. So, if I had one bit, so I think all those are encouraging. Now, if he's sometimes been compared to John the 23rd, who was the Pope who called the Second Vatican Council, that really radically changed a lot of the things I've just been talking about. And I think it's very important, again, to emphasize that then when we talk about the church today, it's a very different church than the church in the 20s, 30s, and 40s. But John the 23rd made major doctrinal reforms in the church, including, of course, ending the anti-Semitism that was in the Catholic Church before that, and embracing other religions in a way that the church hadn't before, accepting them in a way the church hadn't before. It's not yet clear that Pope Francis has in mind making any significant doctrinal changes, so we'll have to wait and see if that's in the offing.
Much of your work on research is in the Vatican archives. Could you please discuss the process of research within the Vatican, the access to full documentation, and what secrets still reside within the archives that you would like to explore? That's a good one.
Well, okay. A lot of people talk about Dan Brown. Dan Brown had a book called Angels and Demons, where the main scene, or the highest drama, was in the Vatican Secret Archives. And first of all, in fact, the main historical archives of the Vatican, its official name is the Vatican Secret Archives. So we're not trying to, glorify it to increase sales of the book. This is what it's actually called. But there are a variety of other Vatican and church-related archives that are important for research like this. I should mention that. For example, the Central Jesuit Archives that are just outside the Vatican, or the Archives of the Inquisition that are a separate archive within the Vatican. But to get access, you have to be a bona fide scholar. For example, they don't let students into the Vatican archives or journalists. It's very well run. It has this vast reading room. Usually about half the people, normally on a normal day, there might be perhaps 80 or 100 people doing research there. About half of them, I would say, would be Catholic clergy. For example, you'll see Polish priests working on the history of the Polish church, and Latin American priests working on their local church history. This is one of the more common kinds of work going on there. One of the difficulties of working there, practical difficulties, is they limit how much material you can see a day to 3 folders of material. So for example, I ended up copying, just from the Vatican archives, probably 8,000 pages of documents. To get 8,000 pages of documents copied out of the Vatican archive means years and years. And the other problem with seeing 3 folders a day is sometimes you go there, and because the guides to the archives are not sometimes terribly detailed, you can open up a folder and see immediately there's absolutely nothing of interest to you.
And that's one of your things.
And if you open up 3 like that in 5 minutes,
You're out.
You're out. Come back tomorrow. So, there are these kinds of war stories that people working in these archives share. In terms of what I'd like to see, first of all, there are some things that aren't there. The one category of things that aren't there that are, if you ask, because I have the rector in charge of the archives, what's not there for scholars to see, they will say personnel records. So some of the issues that recently have gotten a lot of attention in terms of scandals in the church and so on would be of the sort that scholars do not have access to there. But, for example, one of the other things that I certainly speculate about, people ask, is everything made available? So aside from those personnel records, Eugenio Pacelli, for instance, most dramatically, this man who will become the next pope, who's Secretary of State, kept a log of his meetings with the Pope and his daily meetings with the various ambassadors who he met with twice a week in a very small, precise hand. And so when I first went to the archives working on this book, when they opened them in 2006, one of the first things I wanted to see is what were his diaries like of the period around the imposition of the racial laws in 1938. And although year after year you have practically daily, certainly weekly, these entries of his meetings, for basically months at a time in this crucial period, there are no such records.
You think they're not there?
Well, I think there are 2 main. So logically, there's 3 possibilities. One is for some reason he didn't keep these logs, and I think that's unlikely. So I think there are two other possibilities. One is, as readers of my book will know from other of his behavior, there's reason to believe he himself, when he became Pope, might have decided these documents were best given a higher degree of protection and therefore taken away and placed somewhere else. And of course, the other possibility is when they were preparing, it was in 2002 that John Paul II announced he was authorizing the opening of these archives. It'd be another 4 years till they actually put them in order, allowed scholars to enter, that there were some sensitive documents that they decided best not to release at that point. But I don't, it's only speculation.
I had heard there was an agreement between Hitler and the Vatican which dissolved the Catholic Party in exchange for greater Catholic control over education. Could you elaborate on this? And then at the bottom, this person says, I teach in a conservative Catholic school and want to know if I should find a new job.
No, I certainly hope not. And I think, it is important. One of the things is I'll be going around, my book just came out today, so this is the first event since publication. And I'll be speaking in a variety of places. Whenever I'm invited by a Catholic university to speak, I always accept it. I'm very pleased that a number of Catholic universities have invited me, so I'll be speaking in a number of them. So similarly, I think it's important in Catholic schools that these questions, sometimes difficult questions, be addressed. We all, in our own, whatever our group, our own history, there are embarrassing episodes of history, and I think it's important to come to terms with. So it's certainly not just the church that has these kinds of issues, the Catholic Church. But I think what's being referred to is just like in Italy, you had this Catholic Popular Party that was a major political party at the time and an obstacle to Mussolini coming to power. The main obstacle, in a way, to Hitler coming to power was the so-called Center Party, which was the equivalent, the Catholic Party, and the Chancellor of Germany in the previous years had been a member of that party. So Hitler's road to power also involved an ending of the opposition and the existence of a Catholic party. And this happened. There have been a number of very good books recently written by scholars, German scholars in particular, about this history, and a couple of which are translated, that give the details of exactly how this happened, basically over the first 6 months of 1933, where the bishops and cardinals, the archbishops of Germany, in coordination with the Pope and the Secretary of State in the Vatican, basically withdraw their objection to the Nazi Party, which they had objected to before, and essentially the Center Party dissolves, and Hitler is able to reinforce his power.
Let's see what we got here. A lot of these are things that we've talked about. My question is both rhetorical and two-pronged. Mussolini and the Pope are each other's status qua non. Whatever.
Sine qua non.
I'm saying, read it. Must the Pope be must he and the Pope be a match made in heaven? Did I do it right? Yeah, I know. Yeah,
they match made.
Pardon me for butchering you.
Well, it's interesting. I mentioned that the Pope talked about God uses strange instruments. He would also famously, after this agreement is made in 1929, the Pope would refer to Mussolini as a man of providence, a man that providence has allowed us to meet, and said it would take a man who was not wed to the liberal school with its ideas of separation of church and state and so on to come together with the Pope and reach this historic understanding. So it's certainly seen, portrayed by the Pope that way and viewed that way throughout the church in Italy. You have to also realize that it was for the Catholics and including for the clergy throughout Italy, it was very difficult to be in a situation where you couldn't be patriotic. That to be patriotic would somehow be regarded as being anti-Catholic. So there was great relief in the Catholic population of Italy when Mussolini made the deal with the Pope. And so it was greeted as a deal made in heaven in that sense.
Well, here's one thing. Can you tell us more about Taghi Venturi and his scandal? Well, what was his scandal?
Oh, I'm not sure. So I have a chapter in the...
Is this going to get juicy?
Yeah, well, it's a little too juicy, I think, for
Well, good for you. That's a good
this.
one.
But yeah, I have a chapter in the book which is called Pederasts, Assassins, and Spies.
Here we go.
But I don't think I really want to get into that too much.
No,
because you really
but that was what the scandal was about.
Well, so you discover things working in these archives that you weren't expecting to find. And as I did in this case, and there were some other cases that do involve at least allegations of improper behavior, shall we say, of a sort that in more recent years has become more of a scandal in the church. And these have been covered up. One of the things, and we really haven't talked about this, and one of the great resources for doing a project like mine, is that in these years, Mussolini had this incredible thick network of spies. And he was particularly concerned to get spies in the Vatican. So he had many, many informants, some of whom were clergy, some very close to clergy, had very good connections or worked in the Vatican daily newspaper and so on, but who were not themselves clergy. And they were sending in these reports. So one of the things I found, so among the 25,000 pages of archival documents I ended up digitizing, I have hundreds and hundreds of pages of these reports of the spies in the Vatican. And they tell of things that no Vatican document, at least no Vatican document the scholars are able to see, will tell. Just to give you a taste of this, given the question of this case. So Taki Venturi, who's remember the Jesuit, who's the Pope's personal envoy to Mussolini, made big headlines in 1928, including the New York Times and other Washington Post, other American papers. And the headline was, "Anti-fascist assassins come close to murdering Pope's Jesuit envoy to Mussolini." That there had been this assassination attempt, that he had been stabbed in the neck as part of an international anti-fascist plot against him. And in looking at this, of course, he's a key figure in my book, this rather dramatic case, I was able to find both a series of reports from the fascist spies in the Vatican, but also the actual police investigation report, which had formerly been secret and never been made known, as far as I know, by any scholar or anybody else, which reveals a lot about this case and what happened. And as it turns out, it had absolutely nothing to do with an anti-fascist plot and had to do with personal relations.
Sounds kind of J. Edgar Hoover, that whole operation. I have a question of my own, not on the cards. Are you going to do another one? It's also fascinating to me.
Well,
is that a bad question?
I'm fascinated. I've always been fascinated by politics and religion more generally, and as an Italianist, particularly in Italy, the main form this takes is relations between the Vatican and the political life of Italy. And I've looked at it from the 19th century through the 20th century. They haven't yet opened the papers for Pius XII. There's recently, I don't know if some of you may have seen, there was just articles in the press over the last week that rumors that the Pope Francis, as part of his openness, is going to open those archives. Given all the controversy, I think if that happens, I'll need to go start working there, but I haven't done that yet. Yeah.
Oh, good. You pretty much covered the second half of the 19th century and a lot of the 20th century up to Pius XII.
Right. Well, one thing that we haven't said is, I don't know if everybody here knows this, but Alfred wrote a play based on an earlier book I had written called The Kidnapping of Edgardo Mortara, about a Jewish boy who was taken by the Inquisitor in Bologna in the mid-19th century, and the Pope of the time takes him under his wing. He's seized because he'd allegedly been secretly baptized by the Christian servant girl. And Alfred turned this nonfiction work into a play.
Fascinating stuff.
So we've actually worked on popes before.
Yeah,
so
we have.
He knows a little more than he's letting on.
Very little more than I'm letting on. But this is fascinating stuff. And you got to read the book. This only covers a part of what's in the book. I mean, the book becomes like, is he going to make it? Is he going to make it? Is he going to make it? Is he going to give his speech? Now, whether he gave his speech or not, we'll let you decide. But it's pretty dramatic stuff. And we don't know what happened. That's what's so fascinating. You leave, because you can't really say.
Some mysteries remain. Well, I also like to leave it to the reader to decide, not to resolve all the...
I think one of the amazing things about the way you write is you assemble all this material and you stay impartial.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, God, Mussolini was such a rotten guy. But you don't do that. I'd find that admirable.
Yeah, well, also, I think in nonfiction, maybe as in fiction, okay, a book which has here are the good guys, here are the bad guys is not a very good book. In drama, it's not very good drama. Certainly in your play, the fact that the Pope isn't just a bad guy, but is an interesting person with a sense of humor at the same time as he's doing these, what we regard as horrible things, that's what makes it more interesting.
Well, that's what's I think, so exciting and admirable about what you did with Mussolini. I wanted to read about him. Before this, I thought, what the hell do I want to read about Mussolini for? But it really was interesting. And from my point of view, at least, I want to thank you for doing all this and for being here tonight, because I learned a lot more than I did in the book. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you.
That's pretty good. Hey, you want the questions?
Thanks, Doctor.
I'll give them to you.